October 25, 1944, 06:58 hours, Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. The 18.1-inch shell from battleship Yamato screamed overhead, its passage audible even above the engines of escort carrier USS White Plains. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague watched the massive waterspout erupt 300 yards off his port bow, drenching the flight deck with seawater. His hand gripped the bridge railing. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, against his 6 escort carriers, each displacing barely 10,900 tons fully loaded, armed with a single 5-inch gun, capable of 19 knots maximum. The Japanese Admiralty calculated that a single fleet carrier took 3 to 4 years to construct. They knew the Essex-class program wouldn't deliver new ships until late 1943. What they didn't know was that one American shipyard had already launched 50 carriers in 20 months. Sprague's flagship, Fanshawe Bay, shuddered as another salvo straddled her stern. The nearest enemy cruiser closed to within 14,000 yards. Through his binoculars, Sprague could see the massive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships silhouetted against the dawn. His entire task unit, designated Taffy 3, had been providing close air support for troops landing at Leyte Gulf when the Japanese center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait. Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet had been lured north, chasing decoy carriers. The heavy ships of 7th Fleet engaged the Japanese southern force far to the south. Nothing stood between Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's battleships and 130,000 American soldiers on the Leyte beaches, except 6 escort carriers that had been mass-produced on an assembly line in Vancouver, Washington. The escort carriers weren't supposed to fight surface actions. They were too slow, too lightly armed, too vulnerable. Sailors called them jeep carriers, or more grimly, Kaiser coffins. CVE, the designation stood for, was said to mean combustible, vulnerable, expendable. But as Yamato's guns found the range and shells began slamming into USS Gambier Bay's thin hull, something impossible was about to happen. The principles that had allowed one shipyard to produce a carrier every 8 days, standardization, mass production, overwhelming quantity, were about to be tested not in a factory, but in combat. Industrial philosophy was about to meet naval warfare. It was a battle between the world's largest battleship and a fleet built in a shipyard. If you want to see how mass production defeated heavy armor, click the like button to support the channel and subscribe if you haven't already. Because the road to this moment of desperation had begun 22 months earlier, when the arithmetic of carrier warfare became inescapable. May 8, 1942, Coral Sea, USS Lexington, displacing 43,000 tons and carrying 90 aircraft, absorbed 2 torpedo hits and 3 bomb strikes during the battle. Internal explosions from aviation gasoline vapors ignited at 12:47 in the afternoon. By 1700, fires had spread beyond control. The crew abandoned ship at 1707. At 1952, she rolled over and sank, taking 36 aircraft with her. 216 crewmen died. 14 days later, at Midway, Yorktown, hastily repaired after Coral Sea damage, took 3 bomb hits on June 4. Her crew restored power and resumed flight operations by 1400. Then submarine I-168's torpedoes struck at 1336 on June 6. She capsized and sank the following morning. 141 men were lost. By August, Wasp had been torpedoed south of Guadalcanal while covering convoy operations. 3 Type 95 torpedoes from submarine I-198 struck her starboard side at 1444 on September 15. Aviation gasoline fires spread through the hangar deck. At 1520, her captain ordered abandon ship. She sank at 2100 that evening, carrying 193 crewmen. Hornet followed in October during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Japanese dive bombers hit her 4 times between 9:12 and 9:17 on October 26. Torpedo planes added 2 more strikes. Destroyers attempted to scuttle her with torpedoes and gunfire when she couldn't be salvaged. Japanese destroyers found the burning hulk and finished her with 4 long lance torpedoes. 140 men died. In 6 months, the United States Pacific Fleet lost 4 fleet carriers, nearly half its strength. Each represented 3 years of construction, tens of millions of dollars in investment, specialized industrial capacity tied up building turbines and armor plate. The Essex-class program offered hope. 24 new fleet carriers were under construction, incorporating every lesson learned in the early battles. But the first, USS Essex herself, wouldn't commission until December 31, 1942. The building tempo meant most wouldn't join the fleet until late 1943 or 1944. The program demanded specialized shipyard facilities, skilled workers, components with long lead times. An Essex-class carrier required steam turbines that took 18 months to manufacture, armor plate rolled to precise specifications, arresting gear machined to tight tolerances. Each ship needed 33,000 tons of steel formed into complex shapes, 150,000 shaft horsepower turbine plants, catapults capable of launching 15,000-pound aircraft, and arresting gear strong enough to stop them landing at 70 miles per hour. Meanwhile, German U-boats were strangling Britain. In November 1942 alone, submarines sank 134 Allied merchant ships, totaling 807,754 tons. Convoy's SC-107 lost 15 of 42 ships between October 30th and November 5th. Convoy ONS-154 lost 14 of 45 ships between December 26th and 29th. The mid-Atlantic Gap, that stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft, had become a killing ground. B-24 Liberators operating from Newfoundland could patrol perhaps 800 miles out. RAF Coastal Command aircraft from Iceland covered similar distances, but the gap in the middle, roughly 600 miles wide, lay beyond their reach. Convoys crossing this zone traveled without air cover for days, vulnerable to wolf packs that surfaced at night to attack. The Royal Navy pioneered a stopgap solution. Escort carriers converted from merchant hulls. HMS Audacity, converted from a captured German freighter, proved the concept in late 1941 before being torpedoed. Her aircraft had driven off Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes and forced U-boats to submerge, dramatically reducing convoy losses. The principle was sound. Build cheap, simple carriers quickly, use them to close the Atlantic Gap, and provide air support for amphibious landings. The U.S. Navy converted oilers and C-3 cargo hulls into the Bogue and Sangamon classes. These proved effective, but conversion took time. Each hull had to be modified extensively, machinery rearranged, flight decks added to ships never designed to carry them. In June 1942, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser proposed something different to President Franklin D. Roosevelt: purpose-built escort carriers, mass-produced using assembly line techniques. Kaiser had revolutionized Liberty ship construction, reducing build time from over a year to under 90 days by applying automotive production methods to shipbuilding. He believed the same principles could work for carriers. The Navy resisted. Carriers required precision engineering, skilled craftsmen, careful attention to complex systems. They weren't automobiles or cargo ships. But Roosevelt, watching U-boat successes in the Atlantic and carrier losses in the Pacific, overruled naval objections. On June 18, 1942, Kaiser received a maritime commission contract to build 50 escort carriers at his Vancouver, Washington shipyard on the Columbia River. The first keel would be laid November 3, 1942. All 50 were to be delivered by mid-1944. 20 months, 50 carriers, 1 yard. The skeptics believed it couldn't be done. By April 5, 1943, USS Casablanca, the lead ship, slid down the ways at Vancouver. 7 weeks later, on July 8, she commissioned. By then, 6 more were under construction. The assembly line had started moving. The Vancouver yard operated 12 building ways simultaneously, feeding a 3,000-foot outfitting dock where final assembly occurred. Unlike traditional shipbuilding, where vessels grew slowly from keel to completion in a single slip, Kaiser's process involved massive prefabrication. Components were manufactured throughout the yard in sections weighing up to 250 tons, then transported to the building ways for welding. Each Casablanca-class carrier measured 512 feet 3 inches overall length with a beam of 65 feet 2 inches. Standard displacement ran 7,800 tons, increasing to approximately 10,900 tons fully loaded with crew, aircraft, ammunition, and nearly 120,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. The design used a Maritime Commission S4, S2, BB3 hull, a standardized type developed specifically for escort carrier production. The propulsion system reflected wartime pragmatism. Traditional carriers used steam turbines, which offered higher speed but required precision gears manufactured on specialized equipment with long lead times. The Casablanca class employed Skinner Uniflow reciprocating engines, essentially scaled-up versions of machinery used in merchant ships. 2 engines driving twin screws generated 9,000 shaft horsepower, pushing the carriers to 19 knots. The gear shortage that would have delayed turbine production became irrelevant. Protection remained minimal. Unlike fleet carriers with multiple armor belts and armored flight decks, the Casablancas had only splinter plating around vital spaces. The flight deck consisted of wooden planks laid over steel supports. Weight saved on armor translated to faster construction and lower cost. The air group typically embarked 9 Grumman FM-2 Wildcat fighters and 18 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, though the hangar could accommodate more during ferry missions. 1 hydraulic catapult assisted launches. 2 aircraft elevators connected the hangar to the flight deck. Armament consisted of 1 5-inch 38 caliber gun, 8 twin 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, and 12 20mm cannons. A crew of 860, 110 officers, and 750 enlisted operated the ship and air group. By August 1943, the yard was launching carriers monthly. September saw 2 launches, October 3. By December 1943, the tempo reached 1 launch approximately every 10 days. USS Kitkun Bay left the ways December 12. USS Tulagi launched December 21. USS Gambier Bay followed December 28. The workforce swelled to 38,000 at peak employment. Kaiser recruited nationally, hiring women and minorities for positions traditionally closed to them. Many workers had never operated welding equipment or power tools before arriving. Systematic training programs provided basic skills instruction: how to read blueprints, operate acetylene torches, use pneumatic riveters, handle overhead cranes. Workers spent 2 weeks in classrooms and practice facilities before assignment to production positions. Experienced personnel handled critical structural welding and quality control. The repetitive nature of assembly line work allowed relatively unskilled laborers to contribute effectively once trained on specific tasks. Dorothy Rivoli worked as a template marker in the plate shop, laying patterns on steel and tracing outlines with chalk before cutting torches shaped the pieces. Harry Hendricks operated equipment on the graveyard shift at age 14, attending school in the afternoon. Peggy Sater, 16 years old, found herself standing on empty flight decks during night shifts, watching moonlight reflect on the Columbia River, knowing the carriers she helped build would sail to war within months. The yard operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Electric arc welders created sparks visible for miles. Overhead cranes moved continuously, transporting hull sections that weighed hundreds of tons. The noise, rivet guns, metal cutting saws, diesel generators was constant and deafening. Workers wore leather aprons and goggles. Safety protocols existed, but accidents happened regularly in the rush to maintain tempo. Each carrier cost approximately $6 million, roughly 1/5 the price of an Essex-class fleet carrier. The first 50 were completed by July 8, 1944. From keel laying to commissioning averaged 3 to 3.5 months per ship. During those 20 months of production, the carriers began proving their value. USS Guadalcanal departed for Atlantic patrol duty in September 1943. Operating with a hunter-killer group, her aircraft guided destroyers in sinking submarine U-544 in January 1944. In June, Guadalcanal's aircraft found U-505 surfacing west of Africa. Depth charges from escorting destroyers forced the submarine to surface. Boarding parties captured U-505 intact, the only German submarine captured by U.S. forces during the war. In the Pacific, escort carriers provided air support for amphibious landings where their limited speed posed no disadvantage. During Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, escort carriers from the Sangamon and Bogue classes supplemented fleet carrier air power, flying close support missions for troops ashore. The Casablanca-class ships commissioning in late 1943 and early 1944 joined these operations, their aircraft attacking Japanese positions, providing reconnaissance, and maintaining combat air patrols over the invasion fleet. The production tempo never slowed. By March 1944, Vancouver was completing carriers at 8-day intervals. The final ship, USS Munda, CVE 104, commissioned July 8, 1944. 50 identical carriers in 20 months, but quantity alone meant nothing if the ships couldn't fight. October 24, 1944, the Japanese activated Shogo 1, their plan to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. 4 separate task forces converged on the Philippines from different directions. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, along with 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. This force transited the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, where American carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet attacked repeatedly. Musashi absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before capsizing and sinking. Multiple cruisers suffered damage. At 15:30 hours, Kurita turned his force westward, apparently retreating. Admiral Halsey, tracking reports of Japanese carriers approaching from the north, took the Third Fleet's powerful battleships and carriers northward to engage what he believed was the main threat. The Japanese carriers were decoys, largely empty of aircraft, designed specifically to draw Halsey away. The plan worked. At midnight, Kurita reversed course. His reduced but still powerful force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, steamed through San Bernardino Strait heading for Leyte Gulf. No American forces covered the strait. Third Fleet had departed northward. Seventh Fleet's battleships were engaged far to the south, destroying Admiral Nishimura's southern force in the Surigao Strait. 3 escort carrier task units, designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, operated off Samar, providing air support for troops ashore. Each unit comprised 6 escort carriers with destroyer and destroyer escort screens. Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, consisted of carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, all Casablanca-class except Fanshawe Bay. The screen included destroyers Hull, Heerman, and Johnston, plus destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. At 06:45 on October 25th, an American pilot radioed an impossible report: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and numerous destroyers 20 miles north of Taffy 3, bearing south at 30 knots. Sprague initially thought the pilot had spotted Halsey's force. Then Yamato's forward turrets flashed. 13 seconds later, the first 18.1-inch shells exploded among the American carriers. The only U.S. Navy vessels still using 18-inch guns were Iowa-class battleships, none of which operated in this area. Sprague understood instantly. The Japanese had reached an undefended attack position. His 6 carriers displaced 10,900 tons each, mounted single 5-inch guns with a range of 7 miles, and could make 19 knots. Kurita's battleships displaced 30,000 to 72,000 tons, mounted guns ranging from 14 to 18.1 inches with ranges exceeding 20 miles, and could make 27 to 33 knots. The Japanese force could catch Sprague's carriers easily and destroy them with gunfire before the 5-inch pop guns could even reach effective range. Sprague ordered his carriers south toward Taffy 2, launched all available aircraft, and called for his escorts to make torpedo attacks. He broadcast a plain-language distress call: enemy battleships engaging escort carriers at latitude 1140 north, longitude 126.20 east. The destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann reversed course and charged the Japanese formation. Commander Ernest E. Evans aboard Johnston didn't wait for orders. At 0710, he turned his ship toward the enemy and increased to flank speed. At 18,000 yards, Johnston opened fire with her 5-inch guns. At 10,000 yards, she launched 10 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Kumano, then turned into her own smokescreen. One torpedo struck Kumano, detonating her magazines and nearly severing her bow. The cruiser turned away, out of action. But battleship Congo had Johnston bracketed. At 0724, 3 14-inch shells slammed into the destroyer. One hit disabled the aft engine room, cutting speed to 17 knots. Another penetrated the bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone there. The executive officer died instantly. The gunnery officer lost his left hand. Shrapnel wounded a dozen others. Commander Evans, wounded and bleeding from shrapnel cuts to his face and hands, kept Johnston fighting from the exposed aft steering station. Hull and Heermann made their runs. Hull fired 10 torpedoes, 5 at battleship Congo, 5 at heavy cruiser Haguro. Japanese gunfire hit her repeatedly. By 0830, her engines were destroyed, steering disabled, fire control knocked out. She settled by the stern and capsized at 0855. 253 of her crew went down with her. The destroyer attacks disrupted the Japanese formation. Yamato, detecting torpedo tracks, turned north to avoid them, taking herself out of the battle for 10 minutes. Other battleships maneuvered independently, breaking up coordinated fire control. But the Japanese had overwhelming firepower. Heavy cruiser shells began hitting the carriers. Callinan Bay took 14 hits. Fanshawe Bay absorbed 5. White Plains was straddled repeatedly. At 0810, Gambier Bay fell behind the formation, her forward engine room flooded by an 8-inch shell from heavy cruiser Chikuma. Water rushed through the torn hull plating faster than pumps could handle it. At 0820, an 18.1-inch shell from Yamato struck below the waterline, destroying her aft engine room. Speed dropped to 11 knots, then 6 knots, then 3. The Japanese cruisers closed to point-blank range, less than 2,000 yards. Shells tore through the thin hull plating like paper. One passed completely through the island superstructure without exploding. Another detonated in the cruise mess, killing dozens. Johnston, down to 1 operational engine and 1 working gun mount, maneuvered between Gambier Bay and the attacking cruisers. "Commence firing on that cruiser. Draw her fire on us and away from Gambier Bay," Commander Evans ordered. His gun crews fired until Japanese shells disabled the last turret. The Japanese concentrated fire on Johnston instead, recognizing the destroyer as the more dangerous threat. Shell after shell slammed into the destroyer's thin hull. 40mm guns were blown over the side. The mast came down, fire control equipment shattered. By 9:30, she had lost all power. Water poured through a dozen holes. At 9:45, she rolled over and sank. Commander Evans went down with his ship. Only 141 of 327 crewmen survived. As Johnston sank, a Japanese destroyer came alongside, her captain saluting the American sailors in the water. Gambier Bay absorbed hit after hit. At 8:50, her captain ordered abandon ship. 7 minutes later, the carrier rolled over and sank, the only U.S. Navy carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. Of her 854-man crew, 130 went down with the ship. Then, inexplicably, at 9:25, the Japanese turned away. Admiral Kurita, confused by conflicting reports, smoke screens obscuring visibility, and believing he faced fleet carriers rather than escort carriers based on the ferocity of resistance, feared airstrikes from Halsey's force that intelligence had reported nearby. He ordered withdrawal north, then west toward San Bernardino Strait. Sprague's remaining carriers survived, but at 10:51, a different threat appeared: the first organized kamikaze attack in naval history. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 Zero fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs from a Balakat airfield on Luzon. They dove through cloud cover onto the escort carriers. A Zero fighter dove straight down into carrier St. Lo's flight deck at 10:53, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft awaited launch. The kamikaze's bomb detonated among armed torpedoes and bombs. Secondary explosions ripped through torpedo storage, the forward magazine, aviation gasoline tanks. Fire spread through 3 decks within 5 minutes. At 11:03, a massive explosion, probably the forward magazine, tore a hole in the flight deck and blew the elevator 300 feet into the air. The ship listed 20 degrees, fires consuming her from stem to stern. At 11:18, Captain McKenna ordered abandon ship. 25 minutes later, St. Lo rolled over and sank. 114 crewmen died, including 6 who had survived the sinking of Liscombe Bay exactly 1 year earlier. The engagement cost Taffy 3 2 carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, 1,583 killed and missing, and 128 aircraft. But the escort carriers and their destroyer escorts had driven off a battleship force that could have destroyed the invasion fleet. Industrial production methods had created these carriers. Combat revealed what they could endure. The Casablanca-class design reflected a calculated philosophy: build adequate ships quickly rather than perfect ships slowly. In August 1942, when the Maritime Commission drafted specifications for the escort carrier program, requirements emphasized speed of production over performance. The ships needed to carry sufficient aircraft to provide convoy air cover or support amphibious operations. They needed enough speed to keep pace with merchant convoys, roughly 15 to 18 knots. They needed to be built using readily available materials and components with short lead times. The S4, S2, BB3 hull type used standardized merchant ship framing and construction techniques. Unlike fleet carriers, which required custom-engineered hulls shaped for high speed and seakeeping, the escort carriers used simple, boxy hulls optimized for cargo capacity and ease of fabrication. The underwater lines sacrificed hydrodynamic efficiency for manufacturing simplicity. Propulsion machinery came from existing merchant ship designs. Skinner Uniflow engines had been used in Liberty ships and other cargo vessels throughout the 1930s. They were reliable, well understood, and could be manufactured without specialized facilities. Maximum speed of 19 knots was adequate for escorting convoys that traveled at 10 to 12 knots, or supporting amphibious forces that required precise positioning rather than high-speed maneuvering. The flight deck measured 477 feet usable length, barely adequate for launching loaded TBM Avengers, impossibly short for recovering most aircraft without arresting gear. But it sufficed for the FM-2 Wildcats and TBMs that formed the standard air group. The wooden deck construction saved weight and could be repaired by ship's carpenters using materials available at any port. Armor protection was sacrificed almost entirely. The design included splinter plating around vital spaces, engine rooms, magazines, aviation fuel storage, sufficient to stop shell fragments but useless against direct hits. This represented a conscious choice. Adequate protection would have required thousands of tons of armor plate, increasing displacement, reducing speed, complicating construction, and creating bottlenecks in scarce armor production capacity. The designers knew these ships would be vulnerable. A single torpedo hit could sink them. A direct hit from a cruiser's 8-inch shell could penetrate their thin hulls. Kamikaze attacks would be catastrophic. But invulnerability wasn't the goal. The goal was quantity. 20 months to build 50 carriers at one yard represented production capacity no other nation could match. Japan commissioned 3 fleet carriers during this period. Britain launched 4 escort carriers. The United States, using Kaiser's methods, produced 50 escort carriers from one facility while simultaneously building 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and hundreds of destroyers, submarines, and landing craft. The mathematics favored mass production. A carrier sunk could be replaced in 3 months. Trained crews could be replaced from training programs that graduated thousands of pilots monthly. Aircraft lost could be replaced from factories producing fighters and bombers by the hundreds weekly. The Japanese couldn't match this industrial capacity. Every carrier they lost represented years of irreplaceable construction. Every trained pilot killed represented months of training they couldn't afford to repeat. By mid-1944, Japanese carriers sailed with partially trained air groups because qualified pilots had been killed faster than replacements could be trained. The Casablanca-class embodied a fundamental principle. In industrial warfare, adequate equipment produced in overwhelming numbers defeats superior equipment produced in limited quantities. The carriers weren't designed to fight battleships. They were designed to be built faster than they could be sunk, operated by crews trained faster than they could be killed, carrying aircraft manufactured faster than they could be destroyed. That principle would determine survival in the final year of the war. The escort carrier's vulnerability became devastatingly clear as the war progressed into 1945. November 24, 1943, Pacific Ocean southwest of Butaritari. USS Liscombe Bay, CVE-56, steamed in formation off Macon Island, having supported the Gilbert Island invasion. At 05:05, submarine I-175's torpedo struck her starboard side near the aircraft bomb magazine. The resulting explosion tore the carrier apart. She sank within 23 minutes. 644 of her 916-man crew died, including Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix, embarked as commander of Carrier Division 24. February 21, 1945, off Iwo Jima. USS Bismarck Sea, CVE-95, operated 40 miles northwest of the island, her aircraft supporting Marines fighting ashore. At 20:59, 2 kamikaze aircraft penetrated the combat air patrol. The first struck the carrier's aft elevator, crashing through to the hangar deck, where its bomb detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through ammunition storage spaces. The second kamikaze hit forward of the island superstructure 3 minutes later. Fires spread beyond control. At 21:47, the captain ordered "Abandon ship." Bismarck Sea exploded and sank at 21:50. 318 crewmen died. January 4, 1945, Sulu Sea. USS Omani Bay, CVE-79, sailed as part of the support force for the invasion of Luzon. At 17:12, a kamikaze dove through overcast directly into the carrier. The aircraft and its bomb penetrated the flight deck, exploding in the hangar among aircraft being armed and fueled. Within minutes, fire spread through the hangar bay. Exploding torpedoes and bombs ripped through bulkheads. Flooding from firefighting efforts caused a 15-degree list. At 17:50, nearby destroyer Burns fired a torpedo into Omani Bay's hull to hasten sinking and prevent her drifting into the transport area. 95 crewmen died. Between October 1944 and April 1945, kamikazes attacked escort carriers repeatedly during operations at Leyte, Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The carrier's wooden flight decks offered no protection against diving aircraft. Unlike fleet carriers with armored decks that could sometimes survive kamikaze impacts, escort carriers had only thin wooden planking over steel supports. A kamikaze penetrating to the hangar deck invariably caused catastrophic fires among closely packed aircraft. USS Kalinin Bay absorbed 7 kamikaze hits and numerous near misses between October 1944 and January 1945. Her crew fought fires, patched holes, maintained operations. USS White Plains shot down 3 kamikazes but suffered damage from near misses. USS Kitkin Bay took a kamikaze amidships off Mindoro in December 1944, her crew extinguishing fires and resuming flight operations within hours. The carrier's limited anti-aircraft armament made defense difficult. The single 5-inch gun could engage aircraft at medium range. The 8 twin 40mm mounts provided close-in protection, but against multiple attackers approaching from different vectors simultaneously, the defensive envelope proved inadequate. Combat air patrols of 4 to 8 Wildcats helped, but maintaining continuous coverage required constant flight operations that strained maintenance crews and reduced aircraft availability. Tactics evolved through necessity. Carriers deployed in dispersed formations to prevent multiple ships being hit by single attacks. Destroyer screens positioned themselves to provide additional anti-aircraft fire. Combat air patrol stations were established at increasing distances from the task group. Still, kamikazes penetrated regularly. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchangeable. The carriers lacked armor to resist penetration. Their wooden decks couldn't stop aircraft. Their limited speed, 19 knots maximum, prevented evasive maneuvering. Their role, remaining in position to support troops ashore, prevented them from withdrawing when threatened. Yet they continued operating. After each attack, surviving carriers recovered their aircraft, treated their wounded, buried their dead, and returned to station. Damage control parties fought fires with portable pumps and bucket brigades when main systems failed. Shipwrights repaired flight decks using lumber and sheet metal carried in ship stores, often completing patches in hours that would take dockyard workers days. Ordnancemen rearmed aircraft from magazines that hadn't flooded, transferring bombs and torpedoes by hand when hoists failed. Engineers jerry-rigged steam lines around damaged sections, maintained power from auxiliary generators, kept propulsion systems running despite underwater damage. Within hours of attacks that would have sent larger ships to rear-area shipyards for months of repairs, escort carriers resumed flight operations. USS Sangamon, hit by kamikaze off Okinawa on May 4, 1945, had her flight deck repaired by May 6. USS Swanee, struck by a kamikaze on October 25, 1944, the same day as the Samar battle, with a bomb exploding between flight and hangar decks, had flight operations restored within 2 hours, though her aft elevator remained inoperative. USS Salamaua, hit by a kamikaze January 12, 1945, with her flight deck ablaze, engine rooms flooding, electrical power knocked out, and steering disabled, limped back to San Francisco under tow and returned to combat 3 months later. This resilience came not from superior engineering, but from operational necessity and crew determination. The carriers were needed. Troops ashore depended on air support. Convoys required protection. The ships that survived fought on because alternatives didn't exist. Between November 1943 and April 1945, 5 Casablanca-class carriers were lost to enemy action. 45 survived. They logged thousands of combat sorties, supported dozens of amphibious operations, escorted hundreds of convoys. Their crews learned to live with vulnerability, fight fires, patch holes, and keep operating despite knowing another kamikaze might appear at any moment. The price of mass production was measured in these losses, but the same production capacity that built 50 carriers in 20 months could absorb these losses and continue operations. By April 1945, new Commencement Bay-class escort carriers, improved designs incorporating combat lessons, were joining the fleet. The industrial system that created vulnerability through minimal protection provided resilience through replacement capacity. Production: 50 Casablanca-class carriers built, CVE 55 through 104. Construction period: November 3, 1942 through July 8, 1944, 20 months. Average construction time per ship, 3 to 3.5 months. Peak production rate, 1 carrier approximately every 8 days. Single shipyard, Kaiser Vancouver Yard, Washington. Total program cost, approximately $300 million, $6 million per carrier. Workforce at peak, 38,000 employees. Specifications: length, 512 feet 3 inches overall. Beam, 65 feet 2 inches. Displacement, 7,800 tons standard, 10,900 tons full load. Propulsion, 2 Skinner Uniflow reciprocating engines, 9,000 shaft horsepower. Speed, 19.3 knots maximum. Air group, 27 aircraft, typically 9 FM2 Wildcats, 18 TBM Avengers. Crew, 860, 110 officers, 750 enlisted. Combat record: 5 ships lost to enemy action during World War II. 45 ships survived the war. Major operations: Battle of the Atlantic anti-submarine warfare, Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas, Palau, Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. 53 U-boats sunk by Casablanca and Bogue-class carrier hunter-killer groups. USS Gambier Bay, only U.S. Navy carrier sunk by surface gunfire. Total casualties across 5 ships lost, approximately 1,800 killed. Post-war, most ships decommissioned 1946 to 1947, several reactivated for Korean War service as aircraft transports. Last ships struck from Naval Vessel Register 1959 to 1960, all scrapped by 1961. 0 ships preserved as museums. On September 2, 1945, as delegates signed surrender documents aboard battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, 11 Casablanca-class carriers rode at anchor in the harbor. Among them was USS Cape Gloucester, which had supported the Okinawa invasion 3 months earlier. The principles established at Vancouver, standardized design, modular construction, assembly line production, would reshape not just naval warfare but military procurement fundamentally. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Navy reactivated 9 Casablanca-class carriers within months. The ships that could be mass-produced could also be quickly returned to service. But the escort carrier concept itself had reached its limit. Jets required longer decks, stronger catapults, reinforced arresting gear. Helicopters offered new possibilities for anti-submarine warfare that didn't require traditional carriers. By 1960, all 50 Casablanca-class ships had been scrapped, their steel recycled, their design obsolete. What survived was the methodology. During the Cold War, when the Navy needed patrol frigates quickly, designers created the Knox class, standardized, mass-produced, adequate rather than optimal. When the Air Force required transport aircraft in volume, they ordered C-130 Hercules built to unchanging specifications for decades. The principle remained constant: overwhelm opponents with production capacity, replace losses faster than they can inflict them, value quantity when quality becomes unaffordable. The Casablanca-class carriers proved that industrial capacity could be as decisive as tactical brilliance or technological superiority. Japanese naval strategy assumed carriers were rare, precious assets that took years to replace. That assumption shaped their entire operational approach: avoid losses, preserve forces, wait for the decisive battle. American strategy accepted losses as inevitable and replaced them through production. One approach required perfect execution, the other required factory capacity. Off Samar, industrial philosophy met tactical genius and survived. The carriers that were built in 3 months fought battleships that had taken years to construct. They shouldn't have lasted 3 minutes. They lasted 3 hours, long enough for their aircraft and escorting destroyers to drive off a force 10 times their weight of metal. That wasn't the victory anyone planned. It was the victory mass production made possible, not through invulnerability, but through presence. When the Japanese reached Leyte Gulf, carriers were there because 50 could be built in the time it took to build 10. When kamikazes attacked, carriers absorbed hits and kept operating because replacement ships were commissioning weekly. When submarines prowled the Atlantic, hunter-killer groups sailed because enough carriers existed to assign them to roles fleet carriers couldn't spare time for. The last casualty of the Casablanca class was USS Bismarck C, sunk off Iwo Jima on February 21, 1945. She had been commissioned exactly 1 year earlier. In that year, she logged 40,000 miles, launched 5,200 sorties, supported 3 major amphibious operations. Her crew fought fires, shot down kamikazes, rescued downed pilots. When she sank, 597 of her 915 crewmen survived. 3 months later, the war ended. The carrier that had been built in 3 months and fought for 1 year had served exactly long enough. That was what mass production achieved: adequate service for sufficient duration. Not immortality, not invulnerability, just presence when needed in numbers that overwhelmed opposition. The 50 carriers built at Vancouver between 1942 and 1944 weren't the best carriers ever constructed, they were the most numerous class of aircraft carriers ever built, and in industrial warfare, that arithmetic mattered more than any other calculation.